It's like a scene from the slums of India, Nigeria, or Bangladesh. But these are American citizens living on the streets in America's most prosperous cities: San Francisco, Los Angeles, Seattle. It's emotionally jarring. How is it possible that in the wealthiest nation on earth, people are living in these conditions? How is it possible that more than 500,000 Americans are sleeping on the streets, in tents, and in emergency shelters? These are important questions. Governments have mobilized billions of dollars to solve homelessness, but there are more tents on the streets than ever. But despite immense visibility and public attention, it seems as if mass street encampments will be a permanent feature of the urban landscape. This video is about how to understand homelessness, what drives it, what perpetuates it, and why nothing seems to help. In order to understand what's happening with the homeless, it's important to first understand the stories we tell ourselves about homelessness. In West Coast cities, there is a single dominant narrative, which we could call the hard times narrative, that capitalists, landlords, real estate developers, and systemic racism have conspired to put people on the streets. Activists say that homelessness is a manifestation of income inequality, that homeless encampments under a luxury condo tower is evidence of capitalism's moral and economic failure. This narrative is effective for 3 reasons. First, it creates the impression that homelessness is essentially random, the product of chance or raw probability. The subtext here is that it could happen to anyone, or that you're just a paycheck away from being homeless yourself. And if homelessness can happen to anyone, there is no connection between behavior and outcomes. It removes any concept of fault or responsibility from the equation. Second, this narrative suggests that homelessness is a form of social injustice. They'll cite high rates of homelessness among African Americans, Native Americans, and LGBTQ, and argue that this disproportionality is, by definition, the result of discrimination. And finally, the narrative establishes the premise for a policy of unlimited compassion. If homelessness is random, or even more so, if it's a form of social injustice, a good society will act immediately to fix it. To help make their case, activists, officials, and the media can deploy a range of affectively loaded images. People on the streets, people in tents, people suffering, and the first human instinct is to say, let's get them indoors. Which brings us to part 2, the housing hypothesis. Cities like San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, and Los Angeles have all settled on a single solution to homelessness: provide housing with no preconditions. It's a policy called Housing First, and the basic idea is that homelessness is fundamentally a housing problem, and therefore, housing is the solution. The man who invented it, a psychologist called Sam Sembaris, has earned the support of the national media and been called the man who solved homelessness. In the past 20 years, the Department of Housing and Urban Development has spent billions on Housing First programs. Los Angeles recently passed a $1.2 billion bond to build 10,000 housing units for the homeless, and California Governor Gavin Newsom recently said that doctors should be able to write prescriptions for housing the same way they do for insulin and antibiotics. But here's the problem. We've actually put this housing hypothesis to the test. We've gathered the evidence, and it's pretty clear that Housing First as a policy has failed. First, cities can't build their way out of the homelessness crisis. In Los Angeles, their $1.2 billion Housing First program has been plagued by construction delays, cost overruns, and accusations of corruption. They'll likely build fewer than 5,000 total units, while there are more than 59,000 homeless in Los Angeles County. They won't even make a dent in the problem. Second, the most progressive cities, which provide the most services and tolerate the most quality of life crimes, have shown a strong magnet effect, with large numbers of homeless migrating into those cities. In Los Angeles, 35% of the homeless migrated to the county after becoming homeless somewhere else, including 19% who migrated from out of state. In the city of Seattle, the number of migrants is an astonishing 51%. In effect, migration will always outpace Housing First. Third, in the big picture, the cities that spend the most money on Housing First have failed to reduce overall rates of homelessness. Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Seattle each spend more than $1 billion a year on homelessness, counting housing, healthcare, and law enforcement costs. And yet, since 2011, homelessness has increased 15% in LA, 24% in San Francisco, and 25% in Seattle. It's just not working as a strategy to reduce homelessness within their jurisdictions. Now, this all leads us to part 3, and a question. What exactly have West Coast cities gotten wrong? A lot, actually. As it turns out, policymakers have misdiagnosed the problem and consequently formulated the wrong solutions. First, let's revisit the dominant narrative of what causes homelessness, which officials tell us is economic misfortune, lack of affordable housing, racial discrimination, and bad luck. There's a major omission here. While there's an element of truth to all of these supposed causes, they're missing the two most dominant causes of all: drug addiction and mental illness. But this, unfortunately, has become a taboo. Merely mentioning the connection between homelessness, addiction, and mental illness will be met with fierce resistance from activists and reporters. But the facts are quite simple. According to a UCLA study, 75% of the unsheltered homeless have a substance abuse disorder, and 78% have a mental health disorder. In San Francisco, the Department of Public Health estimates that there are more than 4,000 people in the so-called perilous trifecta, being homeless, addicted, and mentally ill simultaneously. And there's another element that is forbidden to say, but well documented. The homeless are nearly 100 times more likely to commit crimes and get booked into jail than the average citizen. According to city and federal data, virtually all of the unsheltered homeless are unemployed, while at the same time, those with serious addictions spend an average of $1,200 to $1,800 a month on meth, heroin, fentanyl, and other drugs. With no legitimate source of income, most homeless addicts support their habit through a hustle, such as theft, fraud, prostitution, and other property crimes. And this brings us to the deepest failure of Housing First. It does nothing to address these underlying human problems of addiction, mental illness, and despair. According to a wide range of studies, Housing First programs do nothing to reduce psychiatric symptoms, reduce drug consumption, or even prevent overdose deaths. In fact, in a recent study in Ottawa, Canada, Housing First participants were 5 times more likely to die than a control group that was simply left on the streets. In other words, enormously expensive Housing First programs sometimes produce worse outcomes than doing nothing. The irony, though, is that despite these obvious failures, none of the major West Coast cities have reduced homelessness at all. They're all doubling down on the same policies that got them here. On the surface, it doesn't make sense. If something isn't working, you change it. But there are 3 critical reasons that these cities find themselves trapped in the status quo. 1, ideology. The narrative about capitalism, racism, rents, and homelessness is extremely powerful and resists any contradiction. Go to a city council meeting in Seattle, show them the evidence about addiction and mental illness, and see what happens. It subverts their narrative about homelessness and even their own identity as compassionate people, because it introduces moral ambiguity. How much of addiction is chance? How much is choice? And if a homeless person is committing crimes to feed an addiction, what is their responsibility? The answers to these questions are deeply uncomfortable, so most activists and reporters in these cities will simply stick to the script and paper over the failures of the current policies by saying there isn't enough funding. 2, institutions. Remember that homelessness is now a billion-dollar industry in the major West Coast cities. There's now a large network of nonprofits, consultants, developers, service providers, and city employees whose livelihoods depend on homelessness. Most of these individuals are doubtlessly genuine in their desire to help, but these institutions are not incentivized towards successful outcomes. In Seattle, for example, this so-called homeless industrial complex spends nearly $80,000 per homeless person per year and has consistently failed to reduce the number of people on the streets. 3, policy. Despite a dramatic rise in tent encampments, open-air drug markets, and property crime, policymakers have sought to decarcerate, decriminalize, and depolice the major cities. In San Francisco, for example, the district attorney has committed to ending all homelessness-related quality of life crimes, including public camping, drug possession, prostitution, and low-level property crimes, all under the theory that enforcing these laws is a form of oppression. But this new policy of mass decriminalization has just concentrated the problems and fed into a sense of greater lawlessness. As one public worker told the San Francisco Chronicle, the alleys are filled with people who are high as a kite, and they're basically controlled by 2 drug dealers and a pimp. These 3 obstacles, ideology, institutions, policy, are formidable. But the real tragedy in these places isn't the ideology, the institutions, or the policies. It's the impact on the homeless themselves, who are left to languish in the streets. If you spend time with the activists and journalists and policymakers in these cities, they talk almost incessantly about compassion. But compassion can't be measured by intentions. It must be measured by outcomes. And on that count, these policies fail dramatically. They speak the language of compassion, but have created a system of enormous cruelty. The tents, the drugs, the overdoses, the deaths, all of these are symptoms of personal despair and deep political pathology. There's the possibility that the addiction epidemic will gradually subside and alleviate what's happening in these major cities. But for things to change through governance, there will have to be a dramatic shift in how people think about homelessness. The dominant narrative will have to be broken apart, the institutions must be reformed and refigured, and the policies will have to be reoriented towards public order, drug recovery, and political accountability. It's not easy, but that's what it will take to alter the tragic fate of more than 100,000 people sleeping on the streets of the West Coast's major cities.